The year was 1966. Field Marshal and National War Hero Bernard Montgomery, to commemorate the 900th anniversary of the Battle of Hastings, published an essay in the Sunday Times celebrating what he saw as the victory of the civilised Norman over the barbarian Anglo-Saxons. The future historian Michael Wood, aged only 18 at the time, wrote a reply in defence of the Saxons, which was also promptly published by the paper. Montgomery himself then invited Michael Wood to the exclusive restaurant of the House of Lords, where Montgomery would further expound his view of the Norman conquest.
You see, my boy, before the Normans, the English had no real civilization. They had been living in the Dark Ages, after all. They had some good leaders. Alfred the Great, for example. He was a good chap. When he made peace with the Danes, it was a great act of statesmanship, years ahead of his time. The sort of leadership we are desperate for today. But the Normans brought ordered government. Look at the Doomsday Book. Ordered government, you see, is the basis of freedom. The conquest was a great boon to this country. It welded together the nation, set it on a road to empire, and the world influence it has had.
Hang on, sir. The Doomsday Book is English, isn't it, sir? It's organised on the English system of shires and hundreds. They must have done that sort of thing many times before. And wasn't the scribe an Englishman? Sir Frank Stenton says...
It was a Norman work. King William sponsored it. Norman acumen made it possible.
I suppose so, I said and sank back. Evidently, we were not going to see eye to eye. Then, looking at him over the table as he spoke, it suddenly clicked. Of course, he was a Norman. His ancestor, Roger of Montgomery, had commanded one wing at Hastings. The Field Marshal may have been a national war hero, but to me that particular war was far away and long ago, much longer ago than 1066. From that moment, as far as I was concerned, he would always be a Norman. This is an excerpt from Michael Wood's In Search of England, one of the first books to get me into history. Wood's narrative of an enduring cultural struggle between these ancient foes right beneath England's surface fascinated me. But now that I'm older and hopefully wiser, I think it's time to explore whether this was anything more than a romantic myth. This brief history will explore the legacy of the Norman conquest on the minds of the English in the centuries after 1066. It examines perceptions of an Anglo-Saxon-Norman conflict, its political connotations, and its legacy on our national history. Anti-Norman hostility was strongest immediately after the conquest, but resurfaced during the English Civil War in the 1630s and 40s in the idea of the Norman yoke. This myth held that prior to the conquest, Anglo-Saxons had lived harmoniously, enjoying freedom, relative equality, and representative government. The Cavaliers, supporters of the king during the Civil War, represented the continued oppression of the Normans. Radical anti-authoritarian groups like the Levellers and the Diggers, who advocated equality before the law, universal suffrage, and religious freedom, saw themselves as reclaiming their ancient Anglo-Saxon rights that had been subverted by Norman tyranny. But it wasn't just the radical fringe that railed against the Norman yoke. It was picked up in mainstream Roundhead political rhetoric too. Our nobility and gentry came even from that outlandish Norman bastard, who first being his servants and under tyrants, secondly, their rise was by cruel murder and theft by the conquest, thirdly, their rise was the country's ruin, and the putting them down will be the restitution of our rights again. This Anglo-Saxon cultural phenomenon dovetailed with the simultaneous Puritan religious phenomenon. The Puritans were strict Protestants who believed that the Church of England was corrupt and poisoned by Catholicism. As such, Protestant theologians look back into the Anglo-Saxon church history to find a more uncorrupted, authentic, primitive form of Christianity. Many prominent levellers and diggers like Thomas Prince, Gerard Winstanley and John Lilburne were also Puritans. Winstanley himself declared that the last enslaving conquest which the enemy got over Israel was the Norman over England. One royalist bitterly noted this sacred belief. That we were all the sons of Adam, born free, some of them say, the gospel hath made them free. And law once subverted, it will appear good equity to such chancellors to share the earth equally. They will plead scripture for it, that we should all live by the sweat of our brows. Anglo-Saxon nationalism also influenced England's legal culture. The rights proclaimed in the Magna Carta were perceived by the prominent English jurist Edward Coke to actually have been ancient Anglo-Saxon laws. According to the historian J.C. Holt, Coke believed that its provisions had been confirmed by the wise providence of so many acts of Parliament, and it embodied fundamental, incontrovertible law which itself went back beyond the Charter to the days before the Norman Conquest. And the parliamentary firebrand John Pym declared of the Petition of Right that there are plain footsteps of those laws in the government of the Saxons. They were of that vigour and force as to overlive the conquest, nay, to give bounds and limits to the conqueror, confirmed by charters of kings, by acts of Parliament. But the petitions of the subjects, upon which those charters and acts were founded, were ever petitions of right, demanding their ancient and due liberties, not suing for any new. Cook's, admittedly historically inaccurate, reading of the origin of the Magna Carta would go on to influence John Lilburne and Richard Overton, both prominent levellers. But by 1645 they would both reject his argument. Why? Not because it was historically inaccurate, but another, far more vital reason. You know, the laws of this nation are unworthy of free people, and deserve from first to last to be considered and seriously debated and reduced to an agreement with common equity and right reason, which ought to be the form and life of every government. Magna Charta itself being but a beggarly thing, containing many marks of intolerable bondage, and the laws that have been made since by parliaments have in very many particulars made our government much more oppressive and intolerable. What he's saying here is that the English laws need to be remade, liberalised according to reason and with the democratic assent of the people. Magna Carta? Who cares? We're a free people. We make our own laws. This sentiment was echoed by Lieutenant Colonel Henry Lilburne, potentially a relative of John Lilburne, who argued that the Norman laws were not slavery introduced upon us, but the augmentation of our slavery before. Thus, by the 1640s onwards, the Levellers had abandoned their appeal to an Anglo-Saxon past, appealing instead to reason, equity, and the law of God. This is summed up most forcefully in Overton's words, that reason hath no precedent, for reason is the fountain of all just precedent. So who stood up for the Normans? Well, no one really. As Quentin Skinner writes, those who advocated the right of conquest during the 17th century hardly saw themselves as a self-conscious group. They made arguments based on Christian duty, on the allegiance that subjects owe to their protectors and to divine right. They didn't see themselves as Normans asserting themselves over the Anglo-Saxon commoners. Indeed, the Norman conquest was a mere example that they used in their writings in terms of defending their more general legal and political principles. But such arguments would be crushed in the latter half of the 17th century. The Roundheads won the English Civil War and ruled until 1660, until, for reasons we can't go into here, the Stuart monarchy was restored. However, King James II in 1688 pushed his luck too far, and his attempt to subvert the laws of England brought back the theory of the ancient constitution in full force in the Whig political movement. Whigs attacked the royal prerogative, that is, the arbitrary power of the British monarch. They were not as radical as the Levellers or the Diggers, arguing based on history and tradition over reason and equality. And in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, they deposed the Catholic King James II, codified a Bill of Rights in 1689 which instantiated the ancient rights and liberties of the English, established parliamentary supremacy, and ensured religious toleration, at least for Protestants. Thus, according to Henry St. John Viscount Bolingbroke, the progression from a free to a slavish constitution of government stopped at the Revolution. As Skinner writes, the Levellers appeal to the past as a way to open discussion, whereas the Whigs appeal to it to end discussion. And of the two schools of thought to emerge from this Norman yoke discourse, it was the Whig perspective, that would dominate the popular view of English history well into the 19th century. Over 100 years later, in the 1790s, the political match of the century was taking place. It was the liberal Thomas Paine in one corner and the conservative Edmund Burke in the other. Burke denounced this modern idea that you could attain rights through revolution. Instead, rights were historic and based in tradition. All the reformations we have hitherto made have proceeded upon the principle of reverence to antiquity. Thomas Paine wasn't having it. You want to bring up heritage? I'll show you your heritage. William of Normandy. There is the head of the list. There is the fountain of honour. The son of a prostitute and the plunderer of the English nation. Burke was concealing the very culprit for subverting traditional English liberties. Paine goes on to emphasise that to that very day, not a single village in England had forgotten the ancient Norman tyranny. As you might have noticed, this is the exact same debate that the Whigs and the Levellers were having a century earlier. According to Burke and the Whigs, England's rights and liberties had been preserved despite the conquest, but according to Paine and the Levellers, Norman tyranny had thoroughly subverted the ancient English constitution and their rights within. And, like the Levellers, Thomas Paine uses the conquest as a jumping off point to assert his own theory of natural rights. But Paine was an outlier. As Christopher Hill writes, after the Glorious Revolution, that is, by the time of the Whig historians, the theory of the Norman yoke had ceased to be of crucial significance for those who were challenging the existing order of society. Whig history was a progressive narrative that saw Britain's history as an evolution towards democracy, prosperity and freedom, and as we know, the basis of this freedom was in its Anglo-Saxon tradition. This view was academically predominant well into the 19th century. According to Hill, the shifting meaning of rights, the popularity of socialism, and the urbanisation and industrialisation that cut off many from their traditional cultural roots meant that for most, the idea of the Norman conquest or the Norman yoke was mere history. But it was also partly because, according to the Whigs, the English had reinstated their rights with the Glorious Revolution. This isn't to say that the idea of an Anglo-Saxon Norman conflict disappeared completely. It was still prominent in literature, like in Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe, or the British politician and future Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli's novel Sybil, or The Two Nations. In this book, the Saxon-descended girl Sybil marries an aristocrat who represents a Norman figure, an example of his belief in a unifying one-nation conservatism. It was only in the 1860s that the Normans really stood up for themselves. Various writers celebrated how the Norman conquest created national unity, ensuring the global colonial destiny of the English race. Yet others emphasised Norman supremacy. One author claimed that Normans still formed the ruling and intellectual aristocracy of the country, and another compared Anglo-Saxons to conquered Afghans and Zulus. And aristocrats like George Nathaniel Curzon, Viceroy of India from 1899 to 1905, were particularly proud of their Norman heritage. Ultimately, into the 19th century, outside of Whig history, the Norman Anglo-Saxon conflict was a mere literary trope. And further into the 20th century, the appeal to an Anglo-Saxon heritage was done less in politically radical terms and more to justify colonialism, racial science, and social Darwinism. I believe it's safe to say that we've poked a few holes in Michael Wood's grand narrative of English history. It seems like the Norman pride of men like George Nathaniel Curzon and Bernard Montgomery don't represent the cultural or civilizational scope that Michael Wood had imagined. Nevertheless, this appeal to Anglo-Saxon culture and heritage was clearly a driving force in British history, despite its divergent forms. So what's the impact of these discourses on the present day? It certainly seems like our view of rights is very similar to the Levellers. Indeed, Quentin Skinner would argue that our modern liberal ideas have far more in common with the Levellers than they do with the Whigs. And Christopher Hill sees the Diggers as an early form of socialist movement. And indeed, some historians do see the beginnings of a modern idea of human rights in the writings of men like Thomas Paine. But history is never that neat and tidy. The historian Peter de Bolle has painstakingly argued that modern ideas of human rights cannot be read back into the 18th, let alone 17th centuries. When Thomas Paine spoke of the rights of man, he wasn't referring to individual rights, but the rights of a collective, the rights of the whole, the nation, the people of England. This is a fundamental difference. But while we might have more in common with the ideas of the Levellers, it was the Whigs that had the greatest influence on British history. The Glorious Revolution and subsequent Bill of Rights was a critical moment in the development of British democracy. It enabled free elections, free speech in Parliament, and instantiated rights prohibiting things like cruel and unusual punishments. But finally, the most decisive outcome of the Glorious Revolution was the changing of the coronation oath. When William and Mary ascended the throne in 1688, they promised to rule not based on the laws and customs of the kings of England, but by the statutes of Parliament. Because it was this that paved the way for all future democratic reform.